I'm never getting out.
I'm Rachel, by the way. Nice to meet you. So you work then with Ben Basin, who's at Hallam?
He was not relieved yesterday.
Was he?
Yeah. He was relieved. He was like, yes. It was so surreal yesterday. I was with like Jam, just seeing if he's in, and the owner took the camera, and we were just like staring at the cordon, and we looked away, and I saw behind the police car Gail Platt from Corrie walk across. Yeah. I just went, it's Gail Platt from Corrie, and everyone looked up and went, she's not there. She'd gone into a bus shelter. And I was like, she's behind that bus shelter, I swear down. I've just seen it's like, no, you've hallucinated. That long, you've hallucinated. And the police officers were talking to someone in the shelter. I was like, she's in that shelter. Anyway, about 10 minutes later, she came walking out. And I went, look, please tell me that is Gail Platt and she's really there. And they were like, that is Gail Platt and she's really there. I was like, what? Going on? Do you know when you're going back to London, are you here all
I don't know. My boss was talking about getting something back today. She's just getting a bit worried that we've got 3 reporters. One is political though, and he's not so much at the reactive sort of thing.
Yeah.
He's specialist. Yeah, specialist and also won't really go to, he's got kids, so he's not a secure anyway, it doesn't matter. She's just getting a bit worried that the 2 reporters up here, all of our regional, because we use our regional reporters quite a lot, so they shipped in from Reading and the girl from Leeds, who are, you know, some of the really good ones who've worked for us for years, and she was getting a bit like everyone's Manchester one or something. London, because obviously the rate is
Yeah, no, I get that.
But no train has been yet booked. And I know that I'm starting at 5 tomorrow, so I'm really worried that I'm going to work 3 till 9 and then she'll say, right, get on the train down to Euston. Hope for your sake, not. How was Sally last night? I think she was a bit upset with some other kids.
I did journalism training with Rachel. Rachel is the reason I'm with my girlfriend, Sally.
That's very good.
Yeah. She's a primary school teacher. It's not for what just talking to you as a mum, as a primary school teacher. I'll come in a minute. So Sally's teaching in secondary school. And I had 5 kids who were there. We took the day off for obvious reasons, but we're okay. But her mum, who's a primary school teacher, called assistant head. They are 9-year-olds in high school, and I wouldn't want to be in the situation they're in. I would explain that to kids.
I can remember one of them when I was in year 4 or 5. There was a girl in my school who got stabbed with a screwdriver when she was out and about. I don't absolutely know what happened, but I can. Yeah, that's what I was thinking about. Just that memory of not really understanding how bad it is, but also like why someone would do that and the impact and all the rest of it. I think it's just the most family, and I don't really know what happened. To go how the teachers have to deal with something on this magnitude, where it's in the news, just to have it to and part of the evidence saw a children's book at Lady
I saw that. Yes.
They played it in the court. You hear a girl going, John Terry I tweeted that. John Terry.
Tell you what, I wouldn't want to be the journalist that works out with a 9-year-old girl. That's Sally's mum.
Oh no, I certainly wouldn't. Les is a terrifying woman. Yeah, God help him.
I think Sally said a few years ago, did a kid at the school die or parents or something? And she said she remembered like people calling through the night.
really funny was a court case in August 2012.
Did that sack them?
So
I realised it was really.
Well, with a bit of luck here, I'll say it's all over now. You go home. Go get bed.
Fine, no.
Could you imagine if he said, yeah, we've caught them all, you can go home?
I'm really excited. Two people sitting beside me that night. I've been in court all day. John Terry and his wife. And he comes in,
Really need
down
these
right
stories
beside
just
me.
to about the homeless guy. She doesn't understand why I haven't got a viral exclusive like homeless guy. It's like, do you know what it's like down there? You sent me to the office to find people, and 20 minutes later she'll be in a taxi here.
I didn't know you were fair. If I did, I'd be sitting back round.
What really shook me up yesterday, I walked the entire perimeter of the court, mainly because I went the wrong way around. I didn't realise how far it extended.
3 miles at one point last night. Well, not last night, the night before.
And at every point, whether a road or an alley, so it was going back round Salford Way in the end. At every point, there was gaps. Cameras from every corner of the world, every language being spoken. And the way they were geared up, like the vests on the back, it's like you're in Basel or something, Manchester.
Every single swimming pool.
I was doing like my mum pieces like, you didn't have to stay, you know what I mean? Like when you go, let's go, get this sound, you know what I mean? Sound dramatic.
Yeah.
You didn't have to do any of that, like it was like just
Yeah. Which was the opposite actually with Westminster, because Westminster was silent. Like Westminster used to sound exactly in London, and it was like occasionally there would be a siren and then you talk about it, but I was just on air being like the streets are just like you can see the stuff and all the rest of it.
Look how it ended. And then
That was the sound. What are you going to be saying for hours?
Well, we know of 2 yesterday, and there's 2 suburban homes. Right now, of course, the search is still ongoing in this building here. What we know from one of the eyewitnesses is about 20 later, they were in vain. Now, we know from previous searches that he's had to control detonations to get through the door into the house. That need explanation. Don't know exactly what or who they're looking for in the apartment. What we know, however, is that he's confirmed part of the ongoing terror investigation.
I'm just waiting for that.
We are expecting again that in that press conference with the Chief Constable, hopefully we'll get some information there. But just to give you a sense of the scene here, this is a very different location from the suburban homes that we saw yesterday being searched. This is a city center location. This is a street where a lot of students live, a lot of young professionals here, design studios, for example, and it's just about a mile and a half away from the arena where the site, of course, of the Vatican City. So we're hoping to get more details as soon as we have something from that.
You get a picture of that? It was what? Cut.
Yesterday, what we saw, U.S. officials taking out the name of the attacker, and this essentially forced British officials to come out and say, yes, this is 20-year-old suspect, South Albania, and that was all the information they gave. Now, since then, we also found out that he was born in Libyan parents, that he's living at one of the addresses that was searched yesterday. We really don't know that much more about him. So this is why everyone wants to know what's happening here.
7 either.
Oh. Yeah.
Yeah, he'll be standing about here, yeah? You see me, hear me? Yeah, hi, I can hear you, Laura. Talk to me.
15 minutes.
It's 15 minutes we're hearing, courtesy of Daniel Sanford from the BBC.
15 minutes.
Can you hear me? 15 minutes.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, 15 minutes from now. It's the same time scale as yesterday. He's hopeless. So, given that he could come out with, I can't do a live because he could come out at any moment and this is where he's going to talk, all right? Right.
Yeah. Top of the hour is the next one, I heard, right?
Yeah, top of the hour.
No, I'm in London.
Sorry guys, so we all move half a meter back, like we were, so we have all a bit more space. Fine. And
What the sentence is, like correlation
You know.
to time it takes to get.
Yeah.
I asked this guy. Sorry. So we all move a little bit back, so we have a bit more space and arms that run.
That makes a lot of sense.
Hey?
Yes.
Okay, let's do that. All of us, please.
Does that help you?
Thank you guys. So we just have a bit of wider angle for everyone. You turn the mic on, right?
Yeah.
is on its way. Held off front page is loud and strong. For wherever we go, you will always know that the army goes rolling along. First to fight for the right and to build the nation's might, and the army goes rolling along. Proud of all we have done, fighting till the battle's won, and the army goes rolling along. And it's high, high, hey, the army's on its way. Down off the gates on its run. For wherever we go, you will always know that the army goes rolling along.
hearing will come to order. Welcome to the Committee on the Budget's hearing on the President's fiscal year 2018 budget. Today we will hear testimony from the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, the Honorable Mick Mulvaney. Good morning once again to everyone, and thank you for being here today. I want to especially thank Mr. Mulvaney, the Director of the White House Office on Management and Budget, for being here today to discuss the President's budget and spending priorities, and we look forward to hearing his remarks. While Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the power of the purse, the federal budget is a collaborative process. The administration, this committee, and our counterparts in the Senate work together to build a budget that reflects our unified priorities. For the last 8 years, we've seen budgets from the White House that reflect the status quo of more spending, more regulation, and never even trying to achieve balance. Over the same time period, economic stagnation led Congressional Budget Office to continually downgrade their projections for economic growth. And what's the result of more spending, more regulation, and slower economic growth? It's a large debt burden on the future generation of Americans, a burden that reflects a moral failure to face head-on our challenges. This administration and this committee agree wholeheartedly on our responsibility to improve our country's fiscal situation and put us on the path to a balanced budget that allows us to start paying down our national debt. Our friends across the aisle will no doubt defend the status quo of the Obama years, where the national debt increased by over $9 trillion, the largest increase of any presidency. Their solutions, which are to simply keep on doing what we've been doing, are not only unsustainable, they are an abdication of our responsibility to current and future generations. Our fiscal situation is not just problematic, it is dire. According to the CBO, the federal debt held by the public, which currently stands at 77% of gross domestic product, will rise to 150% of GDP in the next 30 years if nothing is done. Over the same period of time, deficits will rise from 2.9% of GDP to 9.8% of GDP. These are levels of debt and deficits that have never been seen like this before in American history and are well beyond what the economists predict would result in a crisis. The CBO says that maintaining the status quo would, and I quote, reduce national saving and income in long term, increase the government's interest cost, putting more pressure on the rest of the budget, limit lawmakers' ability to respond to unforeseen events, and increase the likelihood of a fiscal crisis, end quote. Let me repeat a piece of that, the last line. Quote, doing nothing and continuing the status quo will result in a fiscal crisis. Put simply, the status quo is not an option. And this committee and this administration are committed to building a federal budget that begins to deal with our out-of-control spending, incentivizes economic growth through tax and regulatory reform, and makes sure that the government works for the people, not for the bureaucrats. Our committee and this administration also agree on the commitment of funding our military. The threats to our national and homeland security continue to grow. The previous administration left the world less safe and secure with growing threats from all corners of the globe. Ensuring the safety and security of our nation is our first and foremost responsibility of the federal government, and we should give our men and women in uniform the resources they need to complete their mission. I applaud the President for making our national defense a top priority once again. As our committee and our Senate counterparts go through this process of building our budget resolution, the input from the administration officials, such as Mr. Mulvaney, is an invaluable resource to provide information, background, and details on the goals of President Trump. Balancing the budget over 10 years presents major challenges, but also a great opportunity. And for the first time, since I've been serving on the Budget Committee, we have a president who is willing to take action to reform government and to get our fiscal house in order. Our budget resolution is no longer a vision document, it is a blueprint for building the better America we've promised our constituents for years. It is our opportunity to show our real progress in limiting the size and the scope of government, ensuring our children and grandchildren aren't burdened by our unsustainable levels of debt, and persevering for a safe and strong America. I know that working together, we can find the right solutions for the American people. Thank you. And with that, Ms. Jibholt, you are recognized.
Thank you, That's good. As Vice Ranking Member and until Ranking Member John Yarmouth, let me read this statement. Director Mulvaney, it's good to see you. Congratulations on your new position. As you know, this hearing traditionally gives the American people the chance to see the differences between the priorities and values of our two parties. Those contrasts will be made absolutely clear today. The Trump budget is shockingly extreme, the antithesis of what the American people have said they want from their government. It leaves no question of what this administration values: greater gains for millionaires and corporations at the expense of American families, economic progress, and our national security. Yes, the president's budget is a betrayal, a line-by-line tally of broken promises. But above all, it's a shattering of dreams and the loss of hope and opportunity for millions of families. This budget starts by taking away health care, then food, then housing, then education, then job opportunities. For nearly every American family struggling to get ahead, this budget makes that much harder, if not impossible. The level of cuts to investments that Americans need is astonishing and frankly immoral. This budget cuts non-defense discretionary funding for 2018 by a massive $54 billion from the already austerity-level spending cap. Then the budget goes haywire, cutting NDD more and more each year until 2027, when investments are decimated by nearly 30%. And that's without adjusting for inflation. A 30% cut in non-defense discretionary spending, which includes homeland security, education, medical research, veterans' health care, transportation, and much more, represents a total disinvestment in our nation and a complete departure from every standard of responsible governing. But it gets worse. We know that at least 24 million Americans will lose health care coverage because this budget includes the Republican health care repeal bill. This budget cuts Medicaid by another $600 billion. That's a total cut of $1.4 trillion to a program that is the only source of health care for tens of thousands of individuals in every single congressional district in the country. The vast majority of those people are children, seniors in nursing homes, and the disabled. This budget actually targets help for people with disabilities, cutting Social Security disability insurance by as much as $72 billion, despite the president's pledge to not touch Social Security at all. And it cuts $193 billion from the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. This is the program that makes sure our poorest families have at least some chance to put a meal on the table. It provides just $1.42 per person per meal, again, mainly to seniors, children, and the disabled. The president's budget eliminates or eviscerates 14 education and arts programs, makes it harder for Americans to get needed skills to compete for jobs, guts investments in rural and urban communities, jeopardizes the safety of our food, air, and water, and leaves roads and bridges to crumble. The Trump administration makes all these cuts for one simple and frankly disgraceful reason: to hide the fact that their huge tax breaks for millionaires, corporations, and special interests will explode the debt. And they even do that in a dishonest way. This budget relies on absurd economic projections and pretend revenues that no credible economist would validate. It provides no real information on tax reform other than to claim that it's revenue neutral. I guess this is the president's believe me part of his budget. With all due respect, we aren't going to take the president's word for it, particularly when no one else will. And Ranking Member Yarmouth, would you like me to turn it back over to you or finish your statement? Okay, so let me go ahead and finish this. We have been down this road before more than once, and I know you believe it with all your heart, but you're wrong. Tax cuts for corporations and the wealthiest Americans do not pay for themselves. They drive up our deficits and rob our country of needed investments, and that is the truth. And it's also true that we can't trust a budget that sets up false choices. This budget increases 2018 defense spending by $54 billion while cutting NDD by the same amount. We don't have to choose between updating tanks or textbooks, and we should not be pitting teachers against soldiers. To strengthen our national security, we have to ensure that our military and American families have the tools needed for success. And that is our responsibility, to invest in the future of American families and help grow our economy. Education, healthcare, job training, innovation, infrastructure, programs that help individuals with nowhere left to turn, and a tax code that helps families get ahead. Those are American priorities, and they should be the priorities of this Congress and this committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jayapal, and welcome. I know that there was a little confusion in the times, so welcome, Ranking Member Mr. Yarmouth. I look forward to hearing discussion a little bit later. So now I would thank you. In the interest of time, if any other members have opening statements, I ask that you submit them for the record. And I would now like to recognize Director Mick Mulvaney, and thank you for taking your time to come here today. The committee has received your written statement, and it will be made part of the formal hearing record. And you will now have 10 minutes to deliver your oral remarks, and you may begin when you're ready.
Chairman Black, thank you so much for having me. Vice Ranking Member Ms. Jayapal, thank you for the opening statements. Ranking Member Yarmouth, thank you for making it. So I wouldn't dream of doing this without you. So thank you all for having me here today. It's really an honor to be here, to be back in this committee. For those of you who I don't know, I served in this committee for 2 years, and it is an honor and a privilege to be here on behalf of the Trump administration. Mr. Lewis, welcome. You're sitting in my chair. So it's an honor to be here. I'm not going to read my opening statement. I'm going to make a couple comments and we get right to the question and answers. When we looked at the budget for the very first time, I picked it up on Friday. The new Foundation for American Greatness. I spent most of the weekend, as you can imagine, reading it. And as I went through it, it struck me that we could have come up with a different title. And the title could have been The Taxpayer First Budget. Because the first time, in my memory at least, this is a budget that was written from the perspective of the people who actually pay for the government. And we went line by line through what this government does and asked ourselves, can we justify this to the folks who are actually paying for it? If I'm going to take money from Mr. Diaz-Balart in taxes and I'm going to spend it on a program, can I justify to him actually spending that money? If I'm going to take money from you, Ms. Schakowsky, and do the same thing, can I justify it to you? Can I look you in the eye and say, I need to take this money from you in order to give it to a disabled veteran? And I think that I can. I'm not sure I could look at Mr. Woodall and say, Mr. Woodall, I need to take some of your money so that I can give it to a program that is completely ineffective, doesn't help anybody, and is rife with waste, fraud, and abuse. And that's the perspective that we brought to this budget from the very beginning. And maybe that's what's new about the new Foundation for American Greatness budget. The other thing that's new, by the way, is that it does balance. And for those of you who've been here for a long time, you know that it's been a long time since a president's budget has balanced. It certainly hasn't happened since I arrived in Washington, D.C. in 2010. Someone mentioned on the news today this is a moral document, and it is. And here's the moral side of it. If I take money from you and I have no intention of ever giving it back, that is not debt, that is theft. If I take money from you with an intention to pay it back, and I can show you how I intend to pay it back, that is debt. And what we've been doing for too long, both parties, by the way, in this city, have been taking money from people without laying out a plan for how we're ever going to pay it back. And we start doing that with this budget. This budget does balance within the 10-year window, something that is completely new in this town. What's the foundation? The foundation for the plan is 3% growth. In fact, that is Trumponomics. People ask me, you're the budget director, what do you think about Trumponomics? Trumponomics is whatever can get us to 3% growth. And I can assure you, when I am in the Oval Office with the President and we're talking about trade policy, we're talking about energy policy, we talk about tax policy, we talk about health care reform, we talk about budgets, we're trying to figure out a way to get to 3% growth. I have news for you, both parties. if we do not get to 3% growth, it is unlikely we'll ever balance the budget again. And that is not a plan. That is not a plan for the future. That is not moral, to continue to take money from people without having a plan to pay it back. So we do everything we can to try and get to 3% growth. I look forward to the questions today about how we do that. We do all of this, by the way, and still fund the President's priorities. You've heard it by now. We wanted more money for national security, border security, law enforcement, veterans, school choice, even paid parental leave. For the first time ever, President Trump, the first president of either party, is proposing a national paid parental leave program. We have $20 billion in this budget to do that. We don't touch Social Security and Medicare, following through on his campaign promises. And we're able to do all of that and still balance. Why? Because what we did here is try and change the way that Washington looks at spending. We no longer want to measure compassion by the number of programs that we have or the number of people that are on those programs. We want to measure compassion, true compassion, by the number of people we help to get off of those programs. We don't want to measure our commitment to the country by the amount of money that we spend, but instead on the number of people that we help get off of these programs and get back in charge of their own lives. That is what we think makes this the American greatness budget, because we're going to try and get the country back to where we have a healthy economy, people are working again, people are optimistic about the country again. I remind you, if you're under the age of 30, you have never had a job as an adult in a healthy American economy. And a healthy American economy is very, very different than what you've seen for the last 10 years. And the dynamism and the optimism that comes from that is what this administration is about. It's what this president promised. It's what we're going to do everything in our power to deliver, and the budget is a start to that. So with that, Madam Chairman, again, thank you for having me today. I look forward to the questions and in explaining the budget to the members.
Thank you, Mr. Director, and I look forward to the conversation, and thank you for yielding back those 5 minutes, and our members will have more time and opportunity to ask you questions. And so now we will begin the question and answer period, and I'm going to begin with the first question. You mentioned during your opening comments about a moral obligation of balancing the budget, and around here in Washington, you'll hear some folks say this is just kind of a quaint acronym, that we should balance a budget, that somehow that would not be something that would be very important. And you mentioned about it being a moral obligation. I certainly, as a mother and a grandmother, and hopefully a grandmother, great-grandmother someday, do feel that it is our moral obligation to make sure that we leave a strong country without huge deficits for our children and grandchildren. And so will you talk a little bit more about your view on the fiscal and economic well-being and what will happen if we continue these chronic budget deficits and ever-rising debt on the moral issue for the future generations?
Sure. I'll approach it this way. Thank you, Chairman Black. Everybody around this table owes the federal government $60,000. I have 3 17-year-olds. Okay? They're not even out of school yet, and they owe this government $60,000 each. Every man, woman, and child in this room owes the federal government $60,000. I'm not sure if they know that. I'm not sure if we've done a good job as both parties of explaining to people what government truly costs. In fact, I happen to believe we've done a really good job of hiding the cost, the true cost of government from the American people. Yep. I don't believe that people are willing to pay for as much government as they have. And I don't think that we've been entirely honest with them for about the last 40 years on what government truly costs. And I do think there's a moral imperative to tell them, to say, look, this is how much it costs and this is how much we have to take from you in order to do this. Do you really want us to take from you that much money? Or do you want us to try and find a way to balance and to spend less? And balance is something that it seems foreign in this city, which completely stuns me. I don't know how many of you used to be on the state legislatures. I was. I know that Governor Sanford was when he was my governor in South Carolina. But a balanced budget was the ordinary course of business for just about everybody in the world except this body. States have to do it. Families have to do it. Businesses have to do it. I mean, my goodness, my church has to balance its budget or else they cease to function. And I think there's a disconnect between the American people and the government when we don't lay out a path to balance. When you talk about the financial impact of that, Madam Chairman, what you look at as we go forward is every single year we talk about more and more of our money going to pay interest payments on the debt. And I don't know the exact numbers, but at some point in the very near future, we expect to be paying more money for debt than we do for defense. And that worries me. I was in, not this room because this is a temporary room, but I was in the old budget room my very first year when I saw the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff sit in front of this committee and say that he thought the greatest threat to this nation was the national debt. Great countries are not destroyed from without, they rot from within. And that debt, that crushing debt that we have on every man, woman, and child is part of that rot, and that's what we're trying to address in a very candid, open, and honest way in this budget.
And I do appreciate that. And I appreciate you putting it in a context as well, that we would look at our students in high schools and say to them, would you like to have a $60,000 car, or would you like to just pay your share of the debt to the federal government? So I appreciate putting it in a real context where folks understand that when we talk about trillions of dollars, I know even before I came here to Congress and serving in the state legislature, we talked about millions and billions. We don't talk about trillions of dollars as state legislators. And honestly, you sometimes think that's a fictional amount because people cannot wrap their heads around trillions of dollars. But when you put it in a real context of your share of that is $60,000 and you're really, at the end of the day, not paying off even the debt that we're continuing to build up. Along with that, I do want to say it's gratifying to see that the administration is taking a stand on some federal entitlement programs and reforming them. Do you consider entitlement reform an indispensable part of reaching that balanced budget, especially as we look at how we're only spending 1/3 of our total dollars on everyday spending, and the rest of it is over in that column with the debt and the entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, and the other entitlement programs. So do you consider that an indispensable part of what we must be doing? And along with that, do you agree that even if we weren't facing a fiscal crisis, that reforming these entitlement programs really is the right thing to do?
Let me answer it this way, Chairman. I don't believe it's possible. In fact, I know it's not possible to balance the budget solely using the discretionary portion of the budget. There have been years that I was here, 2010, 2011, I believe, where we could have taken discretionary spending to at or near zero, and we still would have had a deficit. In our budget, we do address mandatory spending, what some people call entitlement spending, but we do not address the two that the President simply didn't want to touch, which was Social Security, retirement, and Medicare. I've told the story many times. I actually sat across the desk from him in the Oval Office with my list of mandatory reforms, and at the end of, I think we had 4 meetings on it, he would go, yes, yes, no, 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 and the no's were all Social Security, retirement, and Medicare. And when I pressed him on that, he said, look, I made a promise. I made a promise to people that I would not touch those, and we didn't. And I'll be perfectly frank with you and candid. I didn't think we could balance the budget. And that's why I was extraordinarily impressed with my team when they were able to figure out a way to balance the budget without touching those things. I will tell you it's probably the last time we could do that. It'd be very difficult in the future to do that because of the role that those programs do play in our future spending. But I was excited to be able to keep the President's promise. By the way, the budget is nothing more than a collection of his promises. That's how we wrote it. If he said he wanted to spend more money on something during the campaign, we spend more money here. If he said he wanted to spend less, we spent less here. He said he wanted to add to defense, he wanted to add to border security, wanted to add to school choice and Veterans Affairs, but didn't want to add to the deficit in year one. That's the framework for the budget. But to your larger point, yeah, you cannot address our long-term drivers of our debt without looking at the mandatory side of the budget. It's 3/4 of what we spend, going to 80% in the near future. So, yeah, you would be hard-pressed to be able to balance the budget without looking at mandatory spending.
And along those lines, and I'll conclude my questions here, but along those lines, we sat and talked privately about some of the ideas that you had, and you shared with me that we don't want to hurt people who really need the kinds of services that we want to be sure they get. In other words, we don't want somebody who is unable to afford their heat and air conditioning to go without getting those services. But there are wastes in these programs, and I think that's important that we talk about the wastes in the programs at the same time acknowledging that we're not heartless people. We want to make sure we take care of people, but we also want to make sure our dollars are well spent. Would you give an example of it just in the LIHEAP program about how there are wastes that we need to make sure?
We zien daar ook elke in die
we are actually investing in rebuilding this country. So with that, as I say again, welcome back. And you are an example of someone who I have many disagreements with on policy, but shows that good people can still be friends and work together on these issues.
Mr. Director, do you think you can answer that in 20 seconds?
I could do Big Bird in 20 seconds. Big Bird actually does get a fairly large tax cut, and we want him to, because Henson & Associates, that owns Big Bird, has been paying the highest corporate tax rate in the world for the last several years. And we want them to have more money to reinvest in that type of creativity that created Big Bird in the first place, because we believe that Henson & Associates is a lot more creative than we are. And we believe that money will be much better invested by a private corporation, by private individuals, than it would be by the government. And I'm happy to talk about infrastructure. I'm sure I'll get that question again. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. I want to remind the members one more time that you have a total of 5 minutes. So if you leave the director 20 seconds, we're only going to be able to give him 20 seconds to answer the question. With that, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And Mr. Director, it is really great to have you back here again. Full disclosure, shortly after my questions, I'm going to have to get up and leave because I've got to go chair a hearing for Secretary DeVos, so please don't take anything amiss on that.
We'll let Mr. Yarmouth read your closing statement. How about that?
I want to start and compliment you, frankly. It is a huge sea change to see a representative of the President of the United States bring us a budget that tries to balance and does balance within 10 years. We haven't seen that in a long time. And just the shift in emphasis that represents is a really welcome change. And I want to congratulate you for it. I think, we can all disagree with this or that, but that one change is fundamental to going forward. I also want to thank you for the emphasis on defense. I sit on Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. I think that's a wise choice. And to some of my colleagues that are critical, I want to also point out that the President could have gone a lot further here. There's a lot of people, certainly on my side of the aisle and the House Armed Services Committee, that wanted a $640 billion line. So I think this is actually a pretty prudent balance of letting us move back in the right direction. But even that number, to me, shows fiscal restraint. You could have gone a lot further, and in some ways I would have liked it, but I think you made the wise decision financially for the good of the country. And there are a lot of your proposed cuts in here that I strongly support. I suppose you probably had, you won't take credit for it, but I'm going to give you credit for Social Security disability. I know the President, this is an area in which he has not wanted to go, and I'm glad that you talked to him about this, because I think ultimately that's the big crisis we're going to face, as my friend Mr. Rokita suggested down the road. Entitlements are where we're going to have to come back to at some point. I just think the math drives you there. I've got two areas I want to ask you about. One is with respect to entitlements. What is the spending balance between mandatory and discretionary spending today? And in 10 years under your budget, what will that balance be?
I don't have the numbers in front of me, Mr. Cole, but I think right now you're looking at, 5% of the budget, 72% of the budget is mandatory, and that will continue to grow because what we in essence do is we keep the BCA caps in place on total discretionary, but allow defense to grow. So it should not change from current law in terms of the distribution. Mandatory will continue to get larger and larger as part of our total spending.
Again, I would suggest that bears some more thought, and I hope we see it in your next budget, because honestly that math can't be sustained. And it will crowd out eventually defense and other areas, I think, important national investment.
And we look forward to talking with you about that.
I know you will, because I know from our time together on this committee how serious you take that sort of thing. So I don't question anybody. You work for a president. It's your job to advance and defend his views. But I hope over time we can have that dialogue, because I don't think we're on a sustainable course. One place where I do think we are being, in your budget, penny wise and pound foolish are National Institute of Health and Center for Disease Control. Those are relatively modest investments, and they're investments that Congress on a bipartisan basis has increased in the last 2 years. And let me tell you why we've done it. We've done it partly because we think obviously it's the right thing to do. You want good health outcomes for the American people. But it's also the fiscally prudent thing to do. Right now, in your budget and in Medicaid, we're spending $259 billion a year taking care of Alzheimer's patients and people with dementia. Right thing for us to do. But that will rise to over $1 trillion in uninflation-adjusted dollars by 2050. And we've had now back-to-back the two largest increases in Alzheimer's funding really ever. The reason, again, is to try and deal with a dread disease, but also to get ahead of this thing fiscally so we can either cure it, hopefully, or if you even slow down the progression. So, I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond, but I think there you should look. And I will also tell you, sometime in the president's term, you will have a pandemic. You will have a Zika, you will have Ebola, and cutting the Center for Disease Control, I think, leaves you very vulnerable and the American people very vulnerable. So I want to give you an opportunity to reply to those things.
Let me address very briefly, thank you for that, the NIH, because we actually, despite what you may have heard in the press, we wholeheartedly support research in this area. We especially support research in what we call basic research, which is the stuff that's early in the process, that's far away from marketability, and the stuff that will not get done or is less likely to get done unless the government does it. But I encourage the entire committee to consider this, which is the biggest change we made in NIH, is to look at the overhead costs. If a private foundation gives a university money, typically the university is required to spend 90% of that money on actual research. Only 10% goes to overhead costs. But with our money, it's 72% actually goes to research. So I'd encourage you to look at ways to lower the overhead, because if you look at the numbers, Mr. Cole, at 90% research in our budget, you'd actually be roughly spending the same amount on actual research as you did in previous years.
We'll have that debate another day, but
Yes,
again, I want to thank my friend for being here and thank him for his service.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Director Mulvaney, for being here. I want to recognize Representative Cole's thoughtful comments on the NIH and appreciate your speaking out on that. We have very strong philosophical disagreements about the budget, but I don't want to spend my 5 minutes on that. I'm a freshman new around here, so I'm going to try on two concrete issues where I hope we may find common ground, and I hope you may keep an open mind. The first is the Manufacturing Extensionship Partnership. This was a program that President Reagan started. I worked at the Department of Commerce. It helps small and medium-sized manufacturers. Many of them, the way it helps them is, you look at my district, Silicon Valley, they have cloud technology. This program says, how do we get our small and medium-sized manufacturers using cloud technology, other things, to be competitive, to create jobs in an environment where trade is unfair. My sense is it was zeroed out. It's 0.003% of the budget by some junior staffer. I'm convinced if the president actually met with the manufacturers who are benefiting from the program, or if you met with him, he would probably want to quadruple the budget, given how he campaigned. And my question is, could we at least have the president meet with some of the manufacturers who are benefiting with this program, or could you take a look at it? Because honestly, it was a Reagan program. It's bipartisan, and it's probably the biggest thing we can do to help manufacturers.
It was a Reagan. Thank you for that, Congressman. It was a Reagan program, and I had a policy when I sat in your chair, which was that I was careful about my Reagan quotes and my Bible quotes, because my guess is you could always find something on the other side of the argument from the same source. So I'm going to be very careful with my Reagan quote. I also think he said one time there was nothing as permanent as a temporary government program. This program under the Reagan administration was designed to be temporary. In fact, you're only supposed to be on it for 6 years. There have been folks who have been on it for literally decades, and that's why it got our attention. Again, coming back to the folks who pay for it, say, look, yeah, maybe we can justify giving seed money to businesses so they can get a start and get their feet underneath them, but it's supposed to be temporary, and it's not, and that was the reason we sourced this. We focused on this program. But to your request about having the president get personally involved, I think the president has already shown a tremendous interest in talking with manufacturers. A lot of his focus so far in terms of the executive action has been on manufacturing, and your invitation is welcome indeed, sir. Thank you.
I appreciate it. I just would ask that you take a look at it and the manufacturers benefiting. The second area, I had the privilege of going down to Congressman Hal Rogers' district in Appalachia, near Ranking Member Yarmouth's district. And as you know, Hal Rogers is one of the most distinguished members of this body. Republican, chaired the Appropriations Committee. What I saw there were coal miners' kids getting apprenticeship programs, jobs, learning iOS software for Apple, learning Android software at Google. I mean, these are jobs in Appalachia, jobs in Middle America, future jobs. The Appalachia Regional Commission funded this program, and I think you could talk to Congressman Rogers about it. I urge that, again, that the president may visit this area and see what's happening, because this is how he campaigned. He said, I want to help folks here get the jobs. The Appalachia Regional Commission does exactly that. Again, my hope would be he would quadruple the funding. You know, people often say, well, the Democrats participate in supporting things that the president does. If the president were to say, let's quadruple funding for the Appalachia Regional Commission, I'd vote for it. But that's zeroed out. And is there a way we could have the president visit there, or you visit there, and see firsthand the jobs that are being created for coal miners' kids and others in that area?
And I appreciate that. And I believe the president, and I don't keep track of his travel schedule as probably as closely as I should. I think he's already been to that part of the country at least once. I know he's been to Kentucky at least once. Whether he got into eastern Kentucky, I can't remember. Your points about the Appalachian Regional Commission are well taken, and certainly there are anecdotes of success within that program. It's just when we sat down to look at it, as we mentioned with our new perspective, we had a very difficult time confirming that it was regularly as successful as you mentioned. That being said, we still recognize the need in the area. So while we did zero out the Appalachian Regional Commission, we moved the money around to programs that we thought were even more effective, or at least we could prove were more effective. So the budget provides an additional $80 million for the Department of Agriculture's Rural Economic Infrastructure Grant Program, which includes community centers, housing repair, distance learning, telemedicine, broadband grants, and the like. It also provides an additional $66 million for job training and employment services through the Department of Labor. So again, your points are well taken, and we tend to agree that those areas are a place that do deserve federal attention. I guess I can come back to folks in Southern California and say, can I take some of your money to move to the Appalachia region because of the challenges that it faces? And the answer is yes, but we'd like to do it through more effective programs than we're able to identify at the Appalachian Regional Commission.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Arkansas,
Did
Mr.
I guess
Westerman,
right, by the
for
way, on
5
Southern
minutes.
California? By the way, I guessed at that. Was that not right?
Northern California.
Okay, all right.
Mr. Westerman,
Got
you're
the state
recognized.
right, so.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director Mulvaney, thank you for being here today, and thank you for the hard work that you've put into this budget proposal. It is refreshing to see a proposal that actually balances in 10 years. You're in a tough situation. Anytime you talk about cutting anything, somebody's not going to be happy about that. But it takes courage to put these cuts on the table. We may not all agree with the same areas where we need to prioritize spending, but I think we all, at least on this side of the dais, agree that we have to do something about the debt that's in our country and the burden that it's putting on our children, our future generations. So I appreciate the courage that you took in putting forth this. You know, I've read the headlines about draconian cuts and deep budget cuts. So, you know, I like to go back and look at the numbers. And as I study these numbers, there's a phenomena here that I think the general public may not understand, and maybe even a lot of people in D.C. don't totally understand. But we have this process called the baseline budget. And as I look at the baseline budget, over the 10-year window, it starts at $4.1 trillion and it goes to $6.7 trillion. That's $2.6 trillion of increase over the 10-year window. That's a 63% increase. So if you simplify it and average that, that's 6.3% increase in each of the 10 years for the next 10 years. That's the baseline. So if we look at the budget, this so-called draconian budget that you've proposed, it starts at $4.1 trillion. It goes to $5.7 trillion in 2027, which is a $1.6 trillion increase over the 10-year window, or a 39% increase, or 3.9% per year over that 10-year window. Could you explain in a little more detail about how, when we say cut in Washington, D.C., and I served in my state legislature as well, where we had to balance the budget. I worked in a business where when we talked about a cut, it meant that it was less money next year than it was the year before. And my home and the other families I know in my district, when they talk about a cut to their budget, it actually means you spend less money next year than you spent last year. however, in D.C. in budgeting, we can still spend more money than we spent last year and call it a cut somehow. Would you explain that in more detail?
Sure. Here's how I used to do it back home when I was trying to explain it to people. In Washington, D.C., if we spent $100 on a program last year and $100 on a program this year, back home we would call that a freeze. In Washington, we call that a cut. If we spent $100 on a program last year and $104 on a program this year, back home we would call that an increase. In Washington, D.C., we call that a cut. Back home, if you spent $100 last year and $106 this year, back home you call that an increase. Here we call it a freeze. And it's not until you spend $100 last year and $108 this year that we call it an increase in both normal, back home English, and Washingtonese. And that's because of what you mentioned, baseline budgeting. The baseline assumes that we're going to grow the government at population plus inflation, I think, every single year. And it leads to that. I can't tell you the number of people used to come to my office, Mr. Westerman, and say, 2 years ago, oh, you cut my budget on this. I'm like, no, we didn't. They said, well, everyone's telling me you cut my budget. I said, no, all we did was grow it slower than otherwise. And they said, well, that sounds like an increase. And I said, yes, it does. And they said, well, why is everybody telling me it's a cut? I said, so you will come to Washington and tell me to give you more money. That's how the system works, and that's why I am a big fan of zero-based budgeting, getting away from the baseline and actually using English language that people can understand. If you want to be real cynical about it, under the world where we spent $100 last year and $104, okay, to your conservative friends back home, and we all have them in both parties, you could say, you know what, I cut that program, because in Washington that's a cut. But to your more liberal-minded friends back home, and we all have those in both parties, you say, you know what, I like that program too. We spent more money on that. And both of those statements are right, one using back home English and one using Washingtonese. And I think it's part of the thing that undermines the credibility of the institution, that we have to start speaking a language up here that everybody can understand. So I thank you for drawing attention to the effort. I do encourage this committee to continue to look at ways to articulate how we spend money better. Go back to my opening statement, explaining to people how much government really costs them, because I think in the long term, folks in both parties will be well served by that. But thank you for that question.
I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Director Mulvaney. I am very pleased that I had the opportunity to give the opening statement on behalf of our excellent ranking member. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of things and then get to some questions. Let's talk about clear language and telling the American people exactly what's happening in this budget. We are slashing in this budget, you are slashing Medicaid by $610 billion. Combined with the health care cut, that's almost $1.5 trillion of cuts to a program that currently serves 74 million Americans. So in plain language for the American people, that is a dramatic cut to their health care, for most people health care that they wouldn't be able to get elsewhere. A $1.2 billion cut to Centers for Disease Control. Clear English cuts drug addiction treatment and prevention services. A $1 billion cut to housing assistance programs, including for veterans who are struggling to keep a roof over their heads. We talked about infrastructure already, so I won't go into that. Mention SNAP. This is nutritional assistance for the most needy families in our country. And let's just talk about the border wall for a second. This is a $1.6 billion investment into what I call the wall to nowhere. This is a wall, a down payment on a wall that is ultimately going to cost the taxpayers $40 billion, according to a recent MIT study. And as Janet Napolitano once said when she was governor of Arizona, show me a 100-foot wall, I'll show you a 101-foot ladder. This is not the solution to any of our immigration issues. Now, you've said, Director Mulvaney, that you should have called this a taxpayer-first budget, but I have to ask you, which taxpayer? Out of the almost $1 trillion in tax cuts in this budget, which are on the backs of all these other cuts we've mentioned, 50% of those tax cuts are going to go to the top 1%. And 75% of the tax cuts are going to go to the top 75% of income earners. So what we're doing is taking away essential benefits for working families across this country, positions that the president ran on, and putting them into the top earners in the country. So when you talk about Trumponomics, I think that was the word you used in your opening statement, And you said, let's do anything that gets you to 3% growth. Is that the same philosophy that got the president to 6 separate bankruptcies, $1.8 billion in debt for Trump hotels before he declared those bankruptcies? I'm not really sure what Trumponomics is when you look at the president's records. And so what I'd like to ask you, Director Mulvaney, is can you explain how taking away from programs like the Children's Health Insurance Program, the disabled, and student loan repayments, one of the top issues in this country, Republicans and Democrats alike, $1.4 trillion in student loan debt right now. Can you explain how that benefits the economy or working families across this country? And I might reclaim my time, too, just to make sure, but let's start there.
I can try, because folks are throwing me notes because you raised a bunch of issues, so let me do this in a rapid form as I possibly can. CHIP is being extended. It's not being reduced. Total spending on drug treatment goes up. It's not being reduced. You use the word plain language slashing Medicaid. To most people, plain language slashing Medicaid would mean we spend less next year than we did this year. That's what a slash means, right? That's what you hear in the no, it's not true. I think it's 1 year in the 10-year window where we have a little tiny dip because of the cliff that's caused by the AHCA on the Medicaid expansion states. But generally speaking, across the budget, all we do is slow the rate of growth, which is to say we will be spending more on Medicaid every single year, again, I think except one. And you can call that a slash, but I'm telling you back home, when people say you slashed spending on something, I think they would expect you to think that you're spending less money 1 year versus the previous year. The SNAP, what we do on SNAP is a couple different things, and again, we can take more time on this if you like. We do ask for an able-body work requirement. We can go into the fact that SNAP went up dramatically during the downturn from, I think, roughly 28 million people on the program before the recession to 47 million people on the program at the height of the recession. I think the most recent number we have is roughly 42 or 44 million. We're back near what we like to call full employment. We've had several years of a slow but growing economy. Don't we think that maybe some of those folks should have come off a SNAP? And again, I apologize for doing that. Yeah.
We're limited, so I'm sorry for that. But I think if you look at what the American people thought about the Republican health care bill, you'll see that slash in Medicaid is, in fact, a slash in Medicaid that even Republican governors spoke out against. Let me ask you about Social Security, because you've consistently said that you're not cutting Social Security. $72 billion in cuts
time has
to
expired.
Social Security,
Ms. J.
including
Paul,
Social Security disability insurance. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
If I may, and you have additional questions that you're not able to get in your 5 minutes, I know that the director would be happy to answer those in writing for you. So now I would like to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Renacci.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to thank you, Director Mulvaney, for your service to the House of Representatives, and now as OMB Director, it's always been a pleasure working with you. And I continue to admire your passion for public service and your understanding of fiscal challenge facing our nation. I applaud the President and your office for putting together a budget that balances over the next 10 years and your commitment to addressing the debt and deficit crisis that faces our country. While I may not agree with all the policies, I am encouraged to finally have an administration that understands that we need to get our fiscal house in order. Right now, we're quite simply on an unsustainable path, and this proposed budget is recognition of that reality. I'm going to use a few words. My colleagues on the other side said slashing and cutting, but wouldn't you really agree that your budget is reducing what we borrow from China to pay for programs we don't have money to pay for?
Absolutely.
That's what I thought. And would you also agree that today our corporate tax rate at 35% is the highest in the world, so we can continue to say we don't charge corporations enough, but if we continue to do that, they'll just go overseas, and then we'll have less money to spend. Would you agree with that?
Which is exactly what they've done for the last several years.
Exactly. And on the personal side, today, 70% of our individuals actually pay as pass-throughs corporate businesses, so they're businesses that employ people, and eventually, since 70% of them are paying a rate that's higher than most worldwide tax rates, they're going to find places to go other than the United States, which will also take revenues away from us if we don't come up with a plan to reduce taxes.
Taking jobs with them as they go.
Absolutely. So we can continue to say you're slashing and cutting and all those other words we want to use, but clearly what you're doing is you're looking at a budget and saying we can't continue to borrow, we can't continue to pass this on to our children and grandchildren. Shame on everybody that continues to do this year after year and doesn't realize that all we're doing is handing our children and grandchildren a debt they can never pay. So I appreciate what you're doing. Would you also agree that if we do nothing and we don't start looking at the programs that aren't valuable and that aren't working, that our debt will become one of our greatest concerns and our interest costs will start to begin to swallow the budget? In fact, the Congressional Budget Office says our interest, if it stays that it is, will still triple in 3 years based on our debt growing.
I think they used to put out a report that said it would take 100% of revenues under certain circumstances by the 2050s, but I think they took down that graph.
So we are clearly at a real problem here with budgeting and how we spend money, because we can continue to say we're slashing and cutting, but clearly what we're doing is we're borrowing money we don't have, and we're continuing to spend money we don't have, and we're continuing to be willing to pass that on to our children and grandchildren, and only say that the only way to fix it is to raise more revenues from people when, again, as I said, if we continue to raise our taxes, businesses will just leave, companies will just leave, and we'll have less and less revenue. So I want to make sure we understand that. So I want to switch gears over to tax reform, which I really believe is an opportunity. And I appreciate you talking about getting to 3%, because if we don't at least set a goal around here of 3%, you're exactly right. We might as well say that we will never be able to balance a budget. So whether people agree we can get to 3% or not, I think we should all be focused in on 3%, and that's why I'm a big believer in tax reform and growth. I have a question for you regarding the budget window. Do you believe that Congress should consider expanding the budget window beyond 10 years in order to make tax reform more permanent and increase the likelihood of Congress able to pass some type of tax reform this year?
I do, and my understanding is that you can do that without legislative change, that you all have the ability to look at different periods of time. My understanding is that over the course of the last couple of administrations, some budgets have been 5 years, some have been 7. We sort of settled on this 10-year budget window for the last couple of years, and we'll continue to do it like that. We are exploring the possibility of also looking a little further out, especially when you start to talk about changes in mandatory spending. Even putting aside for a second Social Security and Medicare, if you don't look out beyond the 10-year window, if you want to phase some changes in, a lot of the benefits aren't reaped until outside the budget window. So I think it's a more reasonable way to look at the budget window, and I think it's important for us to look at whatever options give us the best and most common sense view of the economy and our proposals to change it.
You would also probably agree, and I know you and I served on the Budget Committee, but also on other committees. In the old days, with a 10-year budget, we pass legislation that really dumps everything into the 11th year in many cases. All the problems are in the 11th and 12th year. I even think the Affordable Care Act dumped a lot in the 11th and 12th year. Wouldn't you agree?
It is possible, Congressman, to game the system in order to move the costs of a program outside of the budget window. We're coming very close to the outside budget window of the original Affordable Care Act, and now you're starting to see the costs rack up at an exponential rate.
I agree, and I know I'm running out of time. I will yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good to see you, Mr. Director. Really want to first say to you that never before really have I seen such a cruel and morally bankrupt budget. It dismantles our nation's basic living standards, which Americans have turned to for decades. This budget, and you know this, it will push millions of people into poverty and over the edge. This budget destroys people's lives. This budget, what you're doing is you're asking people to fend for themselves, and you're really leaving them out in the cold. And our moral obligation is to make sure that every American has a decent standard of living. This budget is a broken promise, and it's really a betrayal to every American in favor of tax cuts for millionaires, billionaires, and corporations. I'd like to just ask you, how are people going to eat when they need a temporary helping hand with a cut of $190 million in food assistance? Then you add these onerous work requirements, and then yet you cut $1.3 billion in workforce training programs so people cannot be trained or retrained for jobs, which I don't see much in terms of investment in job creation in this budget either. How are people going to get health insurance with a cut of $1.3 trillion in Medicaid? And how are people going to get a house to either purchase or rent with the elimination of the Housing Trust Fund and a $2 billion cut in rental assistance? You're forcing families to choose between putting food on the table and a roof over their head, and that's just downright wrong. You're forcing them to choose between life-saving prescription drugs and higher education. Again, that's wrong. And I guess I just have to say, with looking at these percentage of cuts, EPA 30%, Department of State 29%, Ag 20%, Education 13%, Housing 13%, Interior 10%, Health and Human Services 16.2%, Department of Labor 19.8%, Department of Commerce 15.8%. You wipe out the Minority Business Development Agency, the Department of Transportation 13% cut. For the life of me, I just have to remind my colleagues that Steve Bannon said that part of the goal of this administration was deconstruction of the administrative state, and I think what we see here is really the elimination of the public sector. And so, Director Mulvaney, I just want to ask you, one is, are these SNAP cuts, for example, how do you think people are going to survive when they need this helping hand? Most people on SNAP don't rely on this for a lifetime. It's a bridge over troubled waters.
Thank you, Congressman. I'll deal with a couple of things in reverse order if I can. SNAP, as I may have mentioned, I forgot how many times I've answered the question.
And also, let me remind you, Secretary Perdue mentioned that it was a program that was working. Why fix it if it's not broken? And he appeared to not be aware that you all were going to recommend these cuts.
I think it's reasonable to ask if you had 28 million people on SNAP before the recession, 47 million people on it at the height of the recession, and 42 or 44 million people today, it's not unreasonable to ask if there are folks on SNAP who should not be, because we should have seen that number go down. SNAP should be counter-cyclical. It should go up during bad economic times and come down during better economic times, and we've not seen that. The EPA was a promise that the President made.
But Mr. Mulvaney, at least 20% of people eligible for SNAP don't even receive SNAP because of stigma and other reasons. So there are more people who need SNAP benefits.
That may be. Let me deal with the every American deserves a decent standard of living. Does that include our kids?
And you have a 13% cut in the Department of Education. Those are the most vulnerable kids who need.
What about the standard of living for my grandchildren who aren't here yet, who will end up inheriting $30 trillion in debt, $50 trillion in debt, $100 trillion in debt? What about their standard? Who's going to pay the bill, Congressman? That's what this is all about. That's what this new perspective is. Who is going to pay for all the stuff you just mentioned? Us or somebody else? And I suggest to you, if it's important enough for us to pay to have, then we should be paying for it. Because right now, my unborn grandchildren are paying for it, and I think that is morally bankrupt.
I have grandchildren also, and I want to make sure that they have the opportunity to get a job so that they can help pay for our government, which is a government that should be enhancing the standard of living and making sure everyone has a chance for the American dream.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and Mr. Director. First of all, congratulations on your selection for this position. You got a awesomely tough job, and I appreciate having worked with you for the last 6 years. I associate my position with yours in the sense that our children and grandchildren are expecting us to address this problem now, because it's not going to get any easier. And I hear the cries from my colleagues on the other side calling for more opportunities. Well, I don't know that the federal government has ever created jobs. That's a private market-driven economy that creates jobs, and if we're over $20 trillion in debt, that's just going to get that much worse. I appreciate that we finally have an administration that understands how critically important it is to bend the spending curve in the other direction. And I certainly accept that there are some very, very tough budget decisions to make to get us there. And so I think you and the team have done a remarkable job putting together a budget that does exactly that. Now, we all know that this is a proposal, that ultimately the final say will come from Congress, because that's where the power of the purse resides. But this is a
je sais pas, passer, ça passera pas.
Ah non, passer, oui, pourquoi pas.
Ça passe quand même.
Non, ça dépend. En fait, on a.
You realize how important it is to win we will win this fight. It's a horrible situation. What took place is horrible, unthinkable, but we will win 100%. Thank you. Thank you.
Ditto. We typically have around $1 million at any given time of that kind of grant money. The programs that we operate based on that money are absolutely critical to our mission and are doing phenomenal things for the residents of our county. My hope is that with there is beginning to we're getting more clarity as to what a sanctuary jurisdiction.
This is how I explain Social Security Disability Insurance, Ms. Schakowsky, which is that we also propose a paid parental leave program. We are running that, funding that through the unemployment insurance programs in the states, which is, by the way, the same way Canada does it. New York, New Jersey, California, one other state
Mulvaney, my time is so limited, and I'm not asking
but I'm happy
about
to ask
that particular
no,
program. I'm asking,
you asked about SSDI, ma'am, and I'm happy to get to that. The point of the matter is that many states fund their parental leave through disability. We propose through unemployment insurance. Does that mean that having a baby is unemployment? No. Does it mean that having a baby is disability? No. It just happens to be that that is how the program is structured because the infrastructure is there. Social Security disability is not Social Security. Social Security disability insurance is disability insurance. It's a welfare program for the disabled.
Okay, we disagree on that. I think most Americans disagree that Social Security disability insurance is part of that guaranteed program. Mr. Mulvaney, the President pledged not to cut Medicaid. Now, I just want to point out, we've dealt with this a little bit today, but we are talking about half the births in the United States, 30 million children, and half of all nursing home and long-term care nationwide for senior citizens and people with disabilities comes out of Medicaid. So it's really yes or no does the President's budget cut $1.3 trillion from Medicaid over 10 years?
I'll ask you a question, Congresswoman. When you say cut, are you speaking Washington or regular language?
Will the President's budget mean that Medicaid gets $1.3 trillion less than it would otherwise?
Then the CBO baseline score, the answer is yes. It will spend more money every single year over the previous year, with the exception I've mentioned. That, in my mind, is an increase in Medicaid spending.
Okay. I want to quote you, Mr. Mulvaney. You said that in regard to after-school programs, they're supposed to be educational programs, right? They're supposed to help kids who don't get fed at home, and so they do better in school. Guess what? There's no demonstrable evidence they're actually helping results, helping kids do better in school. The way we justified it was these programs are going to help these kids do better in school, and we can't prove that that's happening. This budget cuts the 21st Century Learning Program. It eliminates it entirely. And this is a program that does before school, after school, and summer programs that do include food for children. What the heck is going on?
Less than 20% of the children who enroll in that program actually move from not proficient to proficient. 20% is a failing grade.
So let's just not feed them.
How do we justify?
My time is up.
Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Lewis, for 5 minutes.
I would thank the chair and welcome Director Mulvaney. Glad to have you back in the Budget Committee. Let me start with a couple of quick questions and a short yes or no answer on a couple of these things, and then we'll get into a more substantive give and take a little bit. It's interesting to note, especially from the other side, that the first balanced budget in over 8 years, or in 8 years, has been greeted by moral outrage. Shockingly extreme, I think is the phrase I heard. Do you find it shockingly extreme that our debt has gone from $10.6 trillion to $19.9 trillion in just the last 8 years?
I absolutely do.
Do you find it shockingly extreme that we're mired in 1.9% growth over the next 10 years?
Frustratingly so, yes, sir.
Do you find it shockingly extreme that we've had record tax revenue last year over $3.2 trillion, and yet we have a $600 billion deficit this year?
It's Unacceptable.
Shockingly extreme that net interest expense is projected to be $768 billion, but if interest rates go back to their post-World War II average 10-year Treasury at 5.7%, it'll be well over $1 trillion.
We'll be broke.
So shockingly extreme that the federal budget outlays has gone from $1 trillion in 1987 to $2 trillion in 2002 to $4 trillion today.
Growing much faster than every other measure of economic output.
Is it still shockingly extreme that federal revenue is above its 50-year average of 17.4% of GDP? Now it's at 17.8% of GDP, and yet we're told it's not enough?
It's never enough, is it?
Shockingly extreme that federal outlays are above their 50-year average of GDP, 20.3%, today at 21%, scheduled to go to 23.4% of GDP.
Just unacceptable.
Federal debt held by the public, 77% of GDP, but actually total federal debt is almost 100% of GDP, correct? Is that shockingly extreme?
And going to have long-term detrimental economic impact on our economy.
And the civilian labor force participation rate back to 1977 levels at 62.8%?
But even lower than it should be given the graying of the American workforce population.
And finally, is it shockingly extreme that the top 25% of taxpayers, those households making $78,000 a year or more, two teachers making $40,000 a year, actually pay 87% of all income taxes collected?
Yeah, that's where the money is, right?
So in spite of all of the debt, all of the spending, all of the Keynesian stimulus, we are stuck at 1.9% growth. The CBO says it's going to be 1.9% growth for the next 10 years. And I'm wondering why that is, if that's all supposed to be so stimulative, and we're going to have the multiplier effect and demand-side economics is going to pull us out of this. Isn't the President's budget and what you're defending today an attempt to make certain that we grow at historical averages by not focusing on this pumping up or priming of demand, but getting investment and productivity back in the economy?
Private investment is what's going to save the country, because that is where innovation comes from, that's where productivity comes from, and that's where GDP growth comes from. We've tried it the other way. We've tried it with huge federal spending for the last 30 years. And now here we are where a large portion of the population, a large portion of this body thinks that 1.9% is the best we are going to ever be able to do. And that bespeaks a pessimism about the country that we simply refuse to accept.
And we've heard this notion of malaise. We're stuck in slow growth. We just can't move. Jimmy Carter talked about malaise. And yet we had 5 consecutive quarters after the pro-growth policies in the early 80s of 7% growth. Where's the empirical evidence that we can't grow at 3.5%?
No, I think the empirical evidence is that we can grow at 3%.
So the emphasis of this budget is to say we've got the highest corporate tax rate in the developed world at 35%. We've got $2.6 trillion in profits that could be repatriated. We've got a pass-through tax rate. Subchapter S, LLC, small businessman or woman, paying not 39.6%, but 44% when you take out the PEP and Ps and the itemized deductions. Lowering those tax rates is going to provide more capital, which is going to increase productivity. The truck driver, is it not true, Director Mulvaney, is always more productive with the truck?
Always.
And therefore, that's what this budget is supposed to do. And we've got data to show it's been done in the past, in the 60s, in the 80s, and even in the 90s.
Not only that, we need to do it to save the country.
In fact, without this sort of growth and this investment in productivity, we'll never balance the budget.
No, sir. Well, I take that back. At some point, we will balance the budget. The question is, do we do it on our terms or on someone else's? Because at some point, people will start to refuse to lend us money. And I'd much rather do it on our terms than somebody else's.
Thank you, Director Mulvaney. Good to see you again, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since, Mr. Mulvaney, you began the meeting by providing a better name for this budget, you described it as the taxpayer-first budget. I describe it as the taxpayer-shaft budget, because that's really what you're doing to millions and millions of people who simply are trying to make sure that they can keep their head above water and live a decent lifestyle. And I find irony in your lamenting that there's some kind of double counting in the total cost of the cuts in Trump care. Because let's be clear, this budget, as you described, does not balance. Hubris doesn't solve basic math problems. The Trump budget counts the savings from tax cuts and projects that these same tax cuts will stimulate growth in the economy and generate so much new revenue that it will produce $2.1 trillion in additional federal revenue. Now, you can't balance the budget by ignoring the reduction in revenue from tax cuts and then count the cuts as generating unprecedented, never-before-realized growth attributable to those tax cuts, and then trying to use that growth in revenue as a pay-for the tax cuts. That is what's called double counting. So let me give a real-life example. If I bought solar panels for my house and I reduced my electric bill through the savings by disconnecting from the grid, but then I didn't count the cost of the solar panels in my household budget and just ignored that there was a significant cost, and then I tried to also count the savings in my electric bill as an offset to the cost of the actual solar panels, then that would be double counting, particularly if I say that the offset is more than the cost of the solar panels. If I went to my accountant and said, my household budget using this configuration is balanced, he would laugh at me. Your Treasury Secretary, when confronted with the double counting, said that it was premature to put in any changes as a result of taxes since you're not far enough along to estimate what the impact would be. So, I mean, look, we can all go through this exercise, and that's certainly what we're doing. We can pretend that we're actually going to come up with a budget that we can all agree on and send to the president when we haven't done that in years. One thing, though, that is absolute certainty is that a budget is an expression of our values. And your values and your boss's values are appalling. If this is a reflection of our nation's values, then we really are in an internecine battle for the heart and soul of this country. So with that in mind, and I'd love to have you respond to that, I'll ask both my questions and then leave you the remaining time. 65% of seniors who rely on Medicaid to be able to afford a nursing home or nursing care in their homes do it through Medicaid. How can states continue to implement innovative programs to deliver long-term care to seniors and people with disabilities in their homes when you're taking $610 billion from them? So if you could answer both of those questions.
Sure, I can try.
Love to you just illuminate the committee on your math.
Yeah, and I'll start, Congresswoman, with the pushback on the never-before-realized growth. That's what's so depressing, is that people think that 3% growth is never before realized. It used to be an annual thing. And yet now here we are assuming that that's how we describe below average long-term growth in this
Please
country.
Address the double counting.
Okay.
The double counting. That's my question.
Yeah, the double counting. Mr. Secretary Mnuchin was right. It is and was too early to make any assumptions about what the final tax bill looks like. We gave a set of principles to the House, and the House and the Senate are both looking at them right now.
So then, clearly, you representing that this budget is balanced is inaccurate.
No, it's not.
You can't both say it's premature and say that the budget balances.
Question if you give me the chance, but I'm absolutely not suggesting that the budget balance is inaccurate. So if I may continue, we assumed we had to make assumptions regarding what the tax bill would look like. Right? There's three assumptions you can make: either it adds to the deficit, subtracts from the deficit, or is deficit neutral. And we assumed, for sake of doing the budget, that it would be deficit neutral. That the removing the exclusions, the deductions, the loopholes would lead us to a deficit neutral tax plan. The dynamic benefit is only counted one time, and that's towards the 3% economic growth. And I'm happy to explain that to you further in writing if you like.
You can explain whatever you'd like. You are counting revenue twice and saying the budget is balanced, and anyone running their household budget that way would be in serious financial trouble down the road, as you are heading us towards.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, Director.
Good morning.
As a previous small business owner, understand the need to balance the budget. Each year we had to match expenses to revenue, or you threaten the future of the company. And of course, as families, we need to do that on an annual basis as well. So I've talked about the federal budget in those terms. You know, we expect families, businesses to do that. Why can't we do that at the federal level? In the states, we've had a tool. We have a balanced budget amendment in Pennsylvania, served in the state Senate there. That required us to, it imposed discipline on the process, if I will. But I brought this up spoke at a Rotary recently, and first question from a constituent said that the federal government's different. We cannot compare the two. We can't compare federal government to businesses because at federal government we can print money, so it's not the same thing. That's, by the way, very different than we had a hearing in this very room. CBO Director Hall was here, and he used a term called sovereign debt crisis. If we don't change the trajectory of our annual deficits, the growth in those deficits. So I'm curious, what is your thought on that? What happens if we continue down the path that we're on right now?
Well, let me speak to the point someone raised to you at the Rotary meeting, which is technically, I suppose they're right. You could simply print money, but what does that mean? What does that mean in the real world? It's not free to do that. If it were, we'd do it every single day, right? When we print money to pay off debts, when we print money to pay for things, what it essentially does is make the existing dollars in your pocket worth less. That's why they call inflation one of the cruelest taxes, especially on the older generations that have saved for retirement, now living off of their investments and so forth. So when you print money, you do nothing but essentially tax the people who are already there. It's a tax in a different form. So you can go back to your folks at Rotary and say, look, I guess you're probably right. Why don't you give me, say, 20% of the money in your pocket and we'll call it even? Because that's what it would take to effectively balance the budget. Actually, I think the number this year is going to be about 14%. But where are we headed? We're headed to where I talked about before, which is we will balance the budget eventually, one way or the other, on our terms or on somebody else's, either by balancing the budget the proper way, printing a bunch of money that impoverishes our citizens, or having somebody else who won't lend us money force certain considerations on us in order to get us to balance as a condition to lending us money. Only one of those outcomes is desirable, Congressman, and that is the one about figuring out a way to do it ourselves before it's too late.
Which requires tough decisions. But I want to also, as a business owner, I saw the real impact. We talk about 3%, 2%, 1% growth, and when you're just talking figures, it doesn't seem like a lot, but we had about 150 employees in our business, and I've been through times of recession, times of low economic growth, and the jobs just weren't available. We were a construction company. And so, small enough company, we knew the employees, we knew the families, and saw the impact when we had to tell people we just simply don't have enough work and had to lay people off. And, I'm one of the reasons that I think we're all here is to provide opportunity for our kids, our grandkids, to help lift people out of poverty, provide that economic mobility. And I think the best possible thing that we can do is have a higher economic growth that will provide that opportunity. I'd just like to hear your response to that.
I'm interested to hear the story about your family. My family was in the home building business. And one of the things, my dad has turned 75 this year.